We are in the very top of Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph. It's a little bit of a confusing Gemara. You need to hold cup. But let me just tell you where we're holding. We're in the middle of a sugya where we're trying to verify whether Rav Nachman's statement is supported by our Mishnah. Rav Nachman had made a statement that when a person has unprocessed produce, let's say figs that you put up to dry on top of a roof, does the entrance of Shabbos automatically make this produce subject to tithing? Now, normally it's not subject to tithing until it's in its final state and final processed state. But because Shabbos has chashivus, everything that I eat on Shabbos is elevated in its importance. So therefore, if I choose to eat figs that are unprocessed on Shabbos, maybe the fact that I've chosen to eat them on Shabbos makes it an achilas keva, a non-happenstance eating, a fixed eating, and therefore they have to be tithed. So the Gemara was arguing this back and forth. Rav Nachman holds Shabbos kova'as l'maiser. With the entry of Shabbos, any produce, even unprocessed produce, has to be tithed. So the Gemara had tried to prove this from our Mishnah to support Rav Nachman. Mar Zutra, Rav Nachman's son, had tried to support his father's statement from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had said that if a person on Erev Shabbos during a Shemitah year is looking on his rooftop and saying, I plan to eat some of those figs on Shabbos.
It's on your chair.
What?
It's on your chair.
Thank you. I plan to eat some of those figs on Shabbos, so then it's perfectly okay. But the Gemara had made a diuk. The Gemara had said the only reason this works and you can eat the figs is because it's a Shemitah year and there's no tithing, which implies that if it was during another year, you would have a problem in that they're not tithed. Mm-hmm. So this proves that even though this is unprocessed, the very fact that it's Shabbos elevates the importance of this eating and therefore necessitates a tithing before you can eat even an unprocessed food. Okay? That's the point that the Gemara was making. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. So the Gemara's question now is, you're telling me the very fact that I designate this produce for Shabbos automatically elevates it and now makes it subject to tithing. That doesn't seem to fit in with other statements that were made by Rabbi Eliezer. And that's where we're up to on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph. V'halo mosaro chazer. V'shaminan leila Rabbi Eliezer da'amar kol heicha de mosaro chazer lo kava. So the Gemara's question is, if I've just made a verbal designation of these figs to say that I plan to eat some of them, then that's what we call produce that has not been permanently committed to that cause. In other words, if I decide not to eat some of those figs, they would just go back to their original state. That's what's called mosaro chozer. And we have a principle from Rabbi Eliezer that any time produce can be returned to its original state of being on the roof processing, then it's not subject to tithing. What do we mean by this? Now we're going to illustrate this. Ditznan. Hanotel zeisim in hama'atan tovel echas b'melach v'ochel v'im tovel v'nasan lefanav asara chayev. So the first statement of the Mishnah is from the Chachamim, and they say like this: you have olives that are placed in an olive press, being prepared for pressing. Now, olive oil is the final state of processing for olives. But so they're in the olive press, they haven't been pressed yet, and you decide, you know what, I want to take a few olives and have a snack. So you take a few olives, and as long as you dip them one by one into salt and eat them that way like a snack, pop them in your mouth, then that's fine, and you don't have to take trumas and maasros. However, if you put down a plate of 10 olives and dip them all in salt and you put them in front of yourself, that's a fixed meal already and they're subject to trumas and maasros. Comes along Rebbe Eliezer and he says, Min hama'atan tohar chayev, min hama'atan tamei potter, mipnei shuhu machzir es hamosar. So Rebbe Eliezer says, look, it depends. Even when it comes to one olive, it all depends on whether or not that olive could be returned after you've taken it out. So the way he illustrates it is that if the olive press is tahor, and then even if you only take out one olive, it's subject to tithing. But if the olive press is tameh, then it's not subject to tithing. You don't have to tithe it if you're just going to pop them in your mouth as a snack. And the reason is mipnei shehu machzir es hamoser, because since the olive is returnable back to the olive press, it's not considered to be subject to tithing. So we just need to clarify that. V'havinan ba maishna reisha u'maishna seifa. What difference does it make if the olive press is tameh or tohar as far as its returnability to the press? V'amar Rabbi Avohu reisha b'matan tohar v'gavra tameh. Delomotzi mahadrulei seifa b'matan tameh v'gavra tameh demotzi mahadrulei. The answer is that the Mishnah over there by the olives is talking about a man who is tameh, and the olives in the olive press are tohar. If he takes them out of the olive press and comes in physical contact with them, he's rendered them tameh, and therefore he cannot return them to the tohar olive press, because the objective was to press these olives in a state of tahara. And since he can't return them back to their place of where they're meant to be processed, then they've been committed to being in this state of being eaten in just as raw olives dipped in salt, and that's when they become subject to trumas and maasros, because they can't be restored back to their processing place. But if the man is tameh and the olive press is tameh, so it doesn't make a difference that he's taken them out. He can always put them back in, since they're going to be pressed in a tameh fashion anyway. And there Rabbi Eliezer says the olives are not subject to tithing. So our question is, why then in the Mishnah does Rabbi Eliezer say, by virtue of the fact that you've committed these things for Shabbos, why does that automatically make them subject to tithing? If even physically removing them does not make them subject to tithing, because they could always go back to their place of processing, well then certainly just a verbal designation should not commit them to tithing, and they should be not subject to tithes. If a physical movement does not make them subject to tithes, then surely a verbal designation should not make them subject to tithes. So the Gemara answers, Masnisa nami b'muktzah tohar v'gavra tameh delo motzi mahadrlei. The answer is the Gemara initially, well, maybe our Mishnah also is talking about a guy who's tameh, and he pulls aside the figs before Shabbos, and by coming in physical contact with them, he renders them tameh. And by doing that, he commits them to eating and not to finishing their processing, and that's why they're chayiv in meiser. But the Gemara says, wait a minute, v'alo muchsarin v'omdinei. You can't say that, because like Rashi says, our Mishnah is v'halolo natlan ela dibura ba'almahu. He didn't physically pick them up in our Mishnah. All he's done is a verbal designation. So how can you even suggest that? Our Mishnah is talking about a guy that he physically precludes them? He doesn't. All he did is a verbal designation. So therefore, our question is: we had tried to deflect the proof. We had tried to say that the Mishnah here does not prove that what Rav Nachman was trying to say. Rav Nachman had made a statement that Shabbos kova'as l'maiser came along. That was and Mar Zutra tried to prove it from our Mishnah. The Gemara had deflected it and said, you know what? That's not a proof, because maybe the whole reason why the figs are considered to be chayiv in trumas and maasros now is because you made a verbal designation. Maybe that's the thing that made them chayiv in meiser, not the onset of Shabbos, but the fact that you verbally stated, I'm going to use these things for tomorrow. So the Gemara said, how could you possibly say that it's the verbal designation that makes them chayiv in meiser? If Rabbi Eliezer holds that even physical movement of the olives does not make them chayiv in meiser as long as they're returnable to their place of processing, then surely verbal designation. So therefore, Ela Omer Rav Shimi Bar Ashi. So Rav Shimi Bar Ashi says, you know what? In reality, you're right. Our Mishnah does prove, like Rav Nachman had said, that Shabbos is kova'as l'maiser. That it's the onset of Shabbos that makes them liable for meiser, and not the verbal designation. There's only one problem. Our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer ka'amart, Rabbi Eliezer l'taimeh. But that doesn't prove that Rav Nachman is correct according to the Chachamim. our Mishnah only goes according to Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim debate this very issue. The Amar Truma Kava V'Kol Shekain Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that by elevating the importance of the food, you can make something subject to further tithing, and therefore Shabbos would be the same thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the Chachamim will agree. Now, what do we mean by that? That Truma Kova'as L'Maiser. So, Ditnan, the Mishnah says, Peiros Shetarman Achelo Nigmara Malachtan. If you have produce that is unprocessed, and you go ahead and jump the gun, and you take Truma from it, but you haven't yet taken Meiser, you haven't taken Meiser Rishon, you haven't taken Meiser Sheni, and now you want to just nibble on it as a snack. So, Rabbi Eliezer Oser Lechol Mehen Aryai V'Chachamim Matirin. Rabbi Eliezer says the very fact that you took Truma from it automatically elevates the food to being in its finished state, even though it's still unprocessed. And the Chachamim say that it doesn't. The Chachamim say that you can nibble on it as a snack. So therefore, the Gemara's argument is at this point as follows. Our Mishnah definitely supports Rav Nachman's contention that Shabbos kova'as l'maiser, that the onset of Shabbos elevates the importance of the food to make it subject to Trumas and Maisros, even in its unprocessed state. The only problem is that our Mishnah goes like Rabbi Eliezer, and the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. So just because Rav Nachman has support from our Mishnah doesn't mean that we paskin like it. That's the argument of the Gemara at this point. Tashma miseifa. But now the Gemara says, okay, fine, but look at the next part of our Mishnah, where it's the Chachamim. It says, V'chachamim omrim ad sheyirshom v'yomer mikan ve'ad kan, period. Our Mishnah had said that even the Chachamim would allow you to partake of the figs on Shabbos. You can't verbally designate it, but what are you supposed to do? Our Mishnah yesterday had said the Chachamim require you to go up to the roof and actually make a physical demarcation between the figs that you plan to eat and the figs that you don't plan to eat. You have to make a line, you have to put some kind of demarcation to designate the figs. And the reason is because they don't hold of breira. Like Rashi had said on the Mishnah, you actually have to say which figs you want to use. You can't just say, well, retroactively the ones that I eat are the ones that I had designated. It doesn't work that way. Now remember, the Chachamim agree with the whole premise of Rabbi Eliezer that this only works because it's a Shemitah year. Time Aderev Shabbos b'Shvius Talav Barisurihu Habishar Shnei Shavot B'nei Yisurin Ninhu Asurim. So you see that even the Chachamim agree with the premise that this is only going to be permitted on a Shemitah year when there's no subjectivity to Meiser. My time Alav Mishum de Shabbos Kava. So it must be because Shabbos establishes a requirement for Trumas and Meisers. So even the Chachamim seem to agree with Rabbi Eliezer. So even though it's true, it says the Gemara, that you've shown that our Mishnah goes like Rabbi Eliezer, that maybe only according to Rabbi Eliezer is something subject to Trumas and Meisers because of the onset of Shabbos, but I can show you from the Seifa that the Chachamim agree with that premise. And therefore now we have a support to Rav Nachman from the Chachamim as well. So the Gemara says, Lo, Shiny Hasam, Kaven da Amar Mikan ve'adkan ani oichel lemachar kavale. So the Gemara says no. It's not the onset of Shabbos that makes these figs subject to Trumas and Maisros. It was the physical demarcation that you made according to the Chachamim. So while it's true that according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's the onset of Shabbos that makes this subject to Trumas and Maisros, but maybe according to the Chachamim, it's not the onset of Shabbos like Rav Nachman had suggested, but rather the fact that you had physically demarcated it. So the Gemara says, Ihachi mai irya Shabbos afilu b'chol nami. Well, if that's the case, then according to the Chachamim, why was it necessary to discuss the case of Shabbos? Then this halacha should be even during the weekday. Gedalia, can I ask you to close the door, please? That even during the weekday we should say this halacha, that if it's during a Shemitah year, you can go over to your rooftop and physically demarcate it and say, I plan to eat this stuff, but know that it's only permitted during Shemitah because during a non-Shemitah year, you'd have to tithe it first. Why didn't the Chachamim address a non-Shabbos case? The Gemara answers, HaKamash Malan detevel muchan hu eitzel Shabbos sheim avar v'tikno mesukan. The answer is telling you a side chiddush, and that is, like the Gemara had mentioned yesterday, that you should know that the only chisaron, the only deficiency of this produce in a non-Shemitah year is the fact that it lacks tithing. But what about the fact that it may be muktzah? No. The fact that it's untithed does not mean that it's muktzah automatically. And the ramification would be is that if someone, during a non-Shemitah year, were to designate his produce before Shabbos and say, I may end up actually eating this stuff, and he doesn't tithe it. So you can say, well, if you didn't tithe it, how can you possibly eat it? It's going to be muktzah. The answer is, what if a guy goes ahead and tithes it, b'di'evet? Is it now muktzah? So the chiddush of the Mishnah is it's non-muktzah and you can eat it, even though he did an aveira. But since tithing is only an isser d'Rabbanan, then b'di'evet it's mutter and it's not considered to be muktzah because a guy actually was thinking about these figs. He knew that he could only eat it if someone tithed it. Maybe someone will tithe it. Who knows?
Is this Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus?
This Rabbi Eliezer. Anytime you see Rabbi Eliezer in the Gemara, it's Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus.
I feel special affinity now.
Yeah.
Yes, these regalas.
So now the
Is
Gemara
something which is usher, muktzah by nature.
Something
which is usher is not muktzah by nature. That thing, how is it possible?
You would think so.
Yeah.
You would think so. But apparently, this Mishnah is indicating that because you verbally or physically demarcated it from before Shabbos, it doesn't have a din of muktzah, even though it was halachically impossible for you to eat them.
Right.
It's not halachically impossible because a guy may have not known the halacha. Maybe I had a Shabbos goy up my sleeve, who knows? Mm-hmm. Or a mini. So now let's raise another contradiction. So we've already pointed out that according to Rabbi Eliezer, Shabbos is kova'as l'maiser, right? The onset of Shabbos makes even unprocessed produce subject to maiser. So let's raise a contradiction. A person is eating a cluster of grapes. Now, a cluster of grapes is considered to be unprocessed because what is the normal processing of grapes? You turn it into wine. So therefore, if you want to eat a cluster of grapes, you could eat it without tithing it. But let's say you go from the vineyard into your courtyard. So some people say that the courtyard in itself makes it subject to meiser because that's bringing it into its place of where you plan to process it. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yigmor, Rabbi Yoshua Omer Lo Yigmor. So in this case, Rabbi Eliezer says, go ahead, knock yourself out and finish the grapes. And Rabbi Yeshua says, no, you're not allowed to finish the grapes. Once it came into the chutzner, you have to tithe it first. Next case is Chashcha B'Leilei Shabbos. Let's say you're eating a cluster of grapes out in the vineyard, and all of a sudden Shabbos comes. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yigmor, Rabbi Yeshua Omer Lo Yigmor. Rabbi Eliezer says, you go ahead, finish eating it, even though it's Shabbos. And Rabbi Yeshua says you can't, because the onset of Shabbos is Kova'as L'Maiser. Now here it's a stira, because Rabbi Eliezer over here says that Shabbos is not Kova'as L'Maiser. And yet we've been saying all along that according to Rabbi Eliezer it is. So the Gemara answers, Hasam Kidakatani Taima, Reb Nasan Omer Lo Kishomer Rabbi Eliezer Yigmor B'Chatzer Yigmor, Eliyotze Chutz L'Chatzer V'Yigmor, V'Lo Kishomer Yigmor B'Shabbos Yigmor, Elamam Tilamotzoy Shabbos V'Yigmor. So the Gemara answers very simply. It's not like Rabbi Eliezer says that you can go ahead and just eat the cluster of grapes on Shabbos, or that you can eat the cluster of grapes in the courtyard. What he means to say is, you have to leave the courtyard, go back into the vineyard. He agrees that bringing the grapes into the courtyard obligates them in Meiser. His only point is that if you remove them from the courtyard, they revert back to their unprocessed state, and you can eat them in a happenstance fashion. And the same thing is true with Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer holds that Shabbos is Kovas L'Meiser, but only on Shabbos. Meaning that once Shabbos is over, if you still have unprocessed produce, then they revert back to their original state of not being subject to Trumas and Meisers. Ki asa rabin amar Rabbi Yechanan echad Shabbos ve'echad Truma ve'echad Chatzer ve'echad Mekach kulan ein kovin ela bedavar shenigmar malachtan. Period. Rabbi Yechanan makes the following statement, which sort of is like the bottom line. He says that that the following things do not require you to tithe your produce. Shabbos, the onset of Shabbos does not require you to do that, right? The fact that you may have taken Truma does not require you to finish the tithing. The fact that you brought it into the Chatzar does not require you to tithe it. Ve'echad Mekach. And the final thing, which we haven't yet seen, is if it changes ownership. right? We'll see that there's an opinion that holds that the actual exchanging of ownership of the produce, even in its unprocessed state, makes it subject to Trumas and
You
Meisers.
didn't mention salting.
Salting. Well, it's not the salting itself that is Koveya Lemeiser. It's the fact that you've pulled it out of its place of processing.
Oh.
It's right. It's not the act of salting, it's per se. Yeah. So kulan ein koven ela bedavar shenigmara malachton. So none of these things require you automatically to tithe. So Shabbos la'afuki midehel. The reason why Rabbi Yochanan told you that Shabbos is not koveya lemaiser is because he wanted to make sure that you don't paskin like Hillel, who also goes like Rabbi Eliezer. Detanya hama'amer peros mimakom lemakom likatzos is the correct girsa. That if a person is gathering produce from one place to another with the objective of placing it to dry for processing, the Kodesh Aleim Hayom, and then Shabbos arrives. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Hillel la'atzmo oseh. That Rabbi Yehuda says that Hillel himself was machmir and said that it automatically becomes subject to Trumas and Meisros because of Shabbos, but he was a loner. In other words, none of his contemporaries agreed with him. Chatzer lafuki mid Rabbi Yaakov, and the fact that we say that the Chatzer is not Kovei Lamaiser is to deflect the statement of Rabbi Yaakov. Ditnan hamavir teinam b'chatzer lekatzos banu v'nei vesa ochlin mehen Aryai upturmin meiser. The Mishnah says that if you bring figs, unprocessed figs, into your courtyard to dry, then your family is allowed to partake of them as a snack. The Tani Allah, Rabbi Yaakov Mechayev, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Poter, and the Brisa says that Rabbi Yaakov disagrees, and he says that once they come into the Chatzar, they are Kovei Elamaiser, and Rabbi Yehuda says they're Poter, and he's just letting us know, Rabbi Yochanan, that we paskin like Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda. And Truma lafukim and Rabbi Eliezer, the din of Truma. He's coming to tell you that we don't paskin like Rabbi Eliezer that we've been talking about. Ditznan perosh tarmanashlo nigmaro malachton Rabbi Eliezer oser lechol mehen Aryai v'chachamim matirin. That we had seen this just a moment ago. That if you go ahead and jump the gun and take truma from unprocessed produce, then that does not automatically obligate you to finish the tithing process of taking meiser as well, according to the Chachamim. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, you are obligated. So Rabbi Yochanan says we don't paskin like Rabbi Eliezer. Mekach kidatanya. What about the law of exchanging or changing ownership? The Brisa says halokech teina me'am haaretz b'makom sh'rov b'nei adam dorsin. If you purchase figs from an am haaretz, in a place where most people process the figs, so it's therefore considered in its unfinished, unprocessed state. So the halacha is ochel mehen Aryai uma'asran demai, that you're allowed to eat them in a happenstance fashion, right? Even though they've changed hands, and when you take meiser from them, you only take meiser as if it's demai. Now, what's the law of demai? Demai is that when you buy produce from an am haaretz, you don't have to take Truma Gedola, because even Amoratzim, who are not as meticulous in all areas of halacha, are very meticulous in taking Truma. They're not so meticulous in taking Meiser. So therefore, we require you to take Meiser Sheni. Okay? And bring that produce up to Yerushalayim. But Truma Gedola you don't have to take. And the same thing is true by these figs. Even though they're in their unprocessed state, we don't require you to take Truma Gedola once you've purchased them from the Am Haaretz, because we assume that he's tithed them already, at least done the Truma tithe.
I'm sorry, Meiser Rishon?
Meiser Rishon you also don't have to take, because since it's only a din of mamanis that you have to give it to the Levi, hamotzi mechavero olav haraya. So since you don't know whether it's been given to him yet or not, he's got to bring proof before.
So Demai you don't have to.
Right. So Demai you don't have to take Meiser Rishon. The coin is you don't give to the coin because we assume. No, but we assume that the Amaretz already took it. Right. So I don't have to take Truma Gedola. I don't have to take Meiser Rishon. I only have to take Meiser Sheni. Because that you have to bring it as a kedusha.
Maybe I'm not so happy about that. Yeah.
Right. Don't worry, we'll make sure you get your due.
Mashiach is going to give.
Yeah. Shma mina tlas. So we learn three things from here. When Mashiach comes, no one will be in Amoritz. Right. Shma mina tlas. We learn three things from this. Shma mina mekach eno kovas ela bedavar shenei gemara malachta. Number one, we see that the very fact that it's changed hands does not make it automatically subject to Trumas and Meisros, because we said that you're allowed to eat it in a happenstance fashion. Ushmamina rov ame haaretz ma'asran hein. We also see from here that the majority of Amaratzim do tithe, and that's why it's only subject to a demai tithe of Meiser Sheni, not Truma Gedola. Ushma mina ma'asrin demai me'amei ha'aretz afilu bedavar shelo nigmura malachto. And we also see that even if it's unprocessed, or there's a greater argument to make that maybe he didn't take Truma Gedola, no. We assume that the Am Haaretz will not sell it before he takes Truma Gedola, even in its unprocessed state, which is an even bigger chiddush. Ulafuke mehadidnan, to exclude that which was taught, hamachlif peros im chavero zelechol b'zelechol, that's to exclude the following brisa or mishnah, which seems to imply that once something changes hands, it becomes subject to meiser, where it says over there, if you barter produce with your friend, where the objective is for him to eat it and for you to eat it in its unprocessed state, or zelakatzos b'zelakatzos, or for your friend to take your produce and process it, and you to take his produce and process it, or zelechol b'zelakatzos, or either his objective is to eat it and your objective is to process it, or vice versa. In all of those cases, chayiv. Once it's changed hands, it automatically becomes chayiv in meiser, even in its unprocessed state. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer lechol chayiv lekatzus pater. Rabbi Yehuda says, I disagree. It only becomes chayiv in meiser if you designate it at the time of the purchase for eating in its current state. But if you've designated it for processing, then even when it changes hands, even when at a barter point, then it doesn't become chayiv in meiser until it's finished process. Hadron Allah Hamevi. Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. This is a little bit easier. Meishilin peros derech aruba b'yom tov avolo b'Shabbos. So the Mishnah tells us that there are certain kinds of exertive acts that you're allowed to do on Yom Tov that normally you wouldn't be allowed to do because it's not for the needs of Yom Tov. The Chaim were concerned that you shouldn't exert yourself on Yom Tov for non-Yom Tov purposes. However, here they're going to be makel because the guy's going to get very upset if he's going to lose a big investment that he needs to take action in order to save an investment. And if we restrict his movement on Yom Tov, he's going to lose his investment. So therefore, the Chachamim made a special provision that even though this is not L'tzarech Yom Tov, we're going to allow you to do it anyway. So what's the example? A guy's got produce drying out on his roof. He's got wheat or barley that is roasting in the sun. All of a sudden, he notices it's about to start raining. So what we do allow this person to do is to toss all of the grain through the skylight, the horizontal window, so to speak, or the door that leads from the roof down into the house. That you're allowed to do. Okay, and as we'll see, there are limitations to that heter as well, but for now you're allowed to do that, even though that's exertion, not for the sake of Yom Tov, because you don't plan to use this wheat or barley on Yom Tov, but we're allowing you to do it because we want you to save your investment. The only thing is you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos. Shabbos might involve hotza'ah, transferring from one rishus to another, and that's why we're not going to allow you to do it on Shabbos. But on Yom Tov, we for sure let you do it. Another thing is umachasim peros bekelim ibnei hadlaf. What we do allow you to do is that we allow you also to cover, let's say with a tarp or with some other utensil, to cover the produce to protect it from rainwater. And we also allow you to cover barrels of wine or oil that are open, and the rainwater is going to run into them. We allow you to cover them. And also, therefore, on Shabbos, we would allow you to, let's say, put a bucket under the eaves trough, which is that new word I learned from Canadians, because we call it a gutter. Yeah, call it a gutter.
On the side of the road.
I know, but there's also a gutter on your roof, right? So we allow you to put a bucket to catch the rainwater in order to prevent it from spilling out into your yard and muddying it or getting things dirty. That you're allowed to do on Shabbos as well. So the Gemara now says, Itmar, Rav Yehuda v'Rav Nasan, Chatoni meshilin v'chatoni mashchilin. That the protocol of this Gemara is to define what the actual word, the verb that is being used in our Mishnah. Some say that the word is meshilin as it appears in our Mishnah, and some say that the word is mashchilin with an extra letter ches. Amar Marzutra, mandatani meshilin lo mishtabish, mandatani mashchilin lo mishtabish. Both are acceptable use. In other words, both verbs are actually correct, because both of them imply lowering something from its present state on the roof down into the house. Mandatani meshilin lo mishtabesh. If the word that you use for that is meshilin, that's not incorrect. Dichsiv ki yishal zeisecha, because when the Torah curses in the Tochacha, it says that you're going to have lots of olive trees, but you'll never get oil from it because the branches will collapse before you have a chance to harvest the olives. And the word for collapsing branches is yishal, right? So you see that means coming down. Uman detani mashchilin lo mishtabesh, and if the word is with the ches mashchilin, that's also okay. Ditnan hashachul vehakasul, that there are two types of blemish that are discussed in Maseches Bechoros that make a firstborn animal blemished, such that the Kohen does not have to shecht it as a korban; he can shecht it for personal use. And one is called the shachul, and the other one is called the kasul. What is the shachul? Shenishmata yerecha, that it has a dislocated thigh, which means that the thigh, it is removed from the hip socket and lowered. So you see that the word shachul means lowered. And kasul shechad mi'archosav gevoa mechaveret, and the word kasul means that one thigh is higher than the other. Amar of Nachman bar Yitzchak mandatani meishirin lo mishtabesh, mandatani mashchirin lo mishtabesh, mandatani manshirin lo mishtabesh. I have another three words that some people have used as the word for meshilin in our Mishnah. One is meshirin, one is mashchirin, and one is manshirin, and all three verbs are acceptable. In other words, whichever verb you use, they all imply a lowering or throwing things down. Mandatani meishirin lo mishtabesh datnan Rabbi Yishmael Omer nazir lo yachav rosho ba'adam b'pnei shemeisher es aseir. There's a Mishnah that tells us that a nazir is not allowed to wash his hair with a detergent that's very harsh, that's made from earth, made from dirt. And the reason is because it causes the hair to fall out. And what do you call hair that falls out? Meishir. So meishir means causes the hair to fall to the ground. So therefore you see that it's a verb that is implying something falling down. Uman detani mashchirin lo mishtabesh tetnan hashachur vehazuk shel misal saparim afal gav shenechleku temein. That there's a certain kind of blade that's used to cut hair called the shachor, or the shachur. And it's also, and so the Mishnah says both the shachor and the scissors, even when the scissor blades are separated, are still makabel tumah. So you see that the word shachor is so called because when you cut the hair falls down. So once again, that verb is appropriate. And the verb manshirin also implies falling down, because the Mishnah says that if a person is walking in water and his clothing drops into the water, so then he's still allowed to walk around with sopping wet clothing on Shabbos, and there's no problem of maras ayin that people will think he laundered it today. That's the point. But the point is that his clothing falls down into the water. That's also an idea of falling down. Inami mehaditnan, or alternatively from the following, that it says, Ezehu leket hanosha b'shas ketzira. That what is the definition of leket that has to be left for the poor? Any produce that falls down at the time of harvest. So all of these verbs imply going down or being lowered. Tanan, meshilin peros derech aruba biyom tov ad kama. So let's try to define the parameters of our Mishnah. We're going to go with a whole long series of questions. We're going to start the questions today. We'll finish the questions tomorrow. And the answer to all of these questions is going to be what?
What's like us?
Teiku. It's going to be Teiku, right? Teiku, we're not really sure. We're going to let it sit until Eliyahu Hanavi comes. So here we're just going to start the questioning, and we'll continue it tomorrow. Amar Reb Zera, Amar Rav Asi, V'Amri La, Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So the question is, how much, what volume of grain or produce are you allowed to throw through the skylight to preserve your investment on Yantiv? So he says, well, we learn another brisa, Mefanen arba v'chamesh kupo shel tevin v'shel tvu mipnei ha'orcham mipnei bittul beis hamedrash. That there's a Mishnah on Shabbos that says that if you have guests coming over and you want to give them a place to sit down in your house, and you have cartons of cargo in your house, you're allowed to move up to 4 to 5 boxes of grain in order to make a place for your guests to be seated. And the same thing is, if you need a place for the yeshiva bachrim to sit because they want to learn, you can move up to 4 to 5 boxes of grain in order to make room for them. So you see that you're allowed to exert yourself up to that amount, and presumably that would be the amount that you're allowed to preserve when you want to throw the grain through the skylight. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Maybe it's apples and oranges. V'dilma shiny hasam, di'ika bittul beis hamedrash, aval hachad leka bittul beis hamedrash lo. You don't have a raya. Maybe over there we're more lenient because we want to give people a chance to learn Torah or to entertain their guests. And maybe there's a special kula because of those needs. But over here it's a purely financial investment, and there's no need on Shabbos, and maybe we're not going to be so lenient. Inami hasam hainu taima darba v'chamesh kupo shari mishum Shabbos techamir v'lo asi l'zilzulei bei aval yantav tekil v'asi l'zilzulei bei klal klalo. Or maybe I'll give you another distinction. Maybe we're more lenient because that is Mishnah's talking about Hilchas Shabbos. And like we've seen before, sometimes the rabbis are more lenient on Shabbos in their takanos and their gzeros than on Yantiv, because we know that because of the various chumras of Shabbos, a person is not going to deprecate the Shabbos just because the rabbis let up a little bit on their gezeros. But on Yantif, which is not as stringent, because Ochel Nefesh is permitted, if we ease up on the prohibitions of exertion, he may end up violating Yantif altogether. So maybe we're more machmir on Yantif over here, and we're going to even limit even more than we are on Shabbos the amount that you're allowed to move. Or inami liidach kis, or maybe look at it from the other direction. Maybe we're going to be more lenient over here, and we'll let you move even more than 4 or 5 boxes worth of grain, because over here you have a financial investment that you stand to lose, whereas in the case of Shabbos, there's no loss of financial investment. So really, there's no way to know, to compare one to the case to the other. So we're going to leave it off as a teku, but we'll continue asking our questions in Yirtz Hashem tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.
Quick question, just to make sure I'm okay. That Shabbos, you have a table like this to set up and
you can unfold the folding table on Shabbos.
I figured you could, but
no, because it's designated for that from before Shabbos. Like from before Shabbos, that's the objective. It's not an act of construction because it's made to be opened and closed regularly.
So
it's like opening and closing a door.
Oh, okay. I was doing it yesterday. I said, I know we do this all the time, but based on what we're learning, I can see it be a shock.
And Rabbi Yeshua that I was with Rabbi Eliezer before. Is that the same Rabbi Yeshua from yesterday?
Yeah.
Are they usually bar pluktas?
They're usually bar pluktas, yeah. Wow. But they loved each other. This also Rabbi Gamliel, who's living at this time, who really got in trouble with Rabbi Yehoshua. Remember that whole story where he made Rabbi Yeshua stand up the whole time?
Yes, Rabbi learned it.
Because Rabbi Yeshua challenged him. It's a Gemara Maseches Brachos.
We learned it,
Yeah, we learned it together.
Yeah.
And it was a result of that. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of... You have to realize, we're talking about the generation of the Churban. The generation of the Churban, these rabbis were at each other's throats, not because they didn't like each other, but there was a Masorah to preserve at a time of ultimate chaos, ultimate pandemonium. Right? And if we don't take a stand now, we're going to lose Judaism forever.
So when did it start solidifying and coming together? How much longer after the Churban? After Yaakov, they went here, they went there. How much longer?
Well, we see about 2 generations after the Churban is when Rebbe codifies the Mishnah. And we see that there was a lot of discord.
40, 50 years, there was pandemonium.
Well, the Churban is 70. Rebbe codifies the Mishnah somewhere between 150 and 200 of the Common Era.
A lot longer.
Yeah. So, things Rebbe saw that people were, instead of things calming down, things were getting more chaotic as time was going on. That's why he finally said, we got to put this down in a Mishnah.
But once it was written, everything was a stable time.
It seemed like everything started to calm down.
Like there was all for 500 years, it was...
So one thing I didn't understand, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus remained in Cherem the rest of his life?
That's what he said, yes.
He died in Cherem.
So but he's not looked at negatively.
Not
we don't
at
say,
all.
let's say, we'll have to Acher, right?
Right.
Acher is Acher, right?
Because Rabbi Eliezer was from his whole life. The only thing there was is that he wouldn't...
He stood by his
right. He wouldn't abide by the majority rule. That was the only thing.
But that means you don't want to mention his name. You don't want to give him
the students that you don't talk about. Acher had Rabbi Meir afterwards, right? Who was?
Well, Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva was his prime disciple. Rabbi Akiva was the one who notified him that he was put into Cherem.
How could he not acknowledge that he was wrong? They say,
No. He fully acknowledged that this was the process, but he couldn't he couldn't abide by it because he just felt that, I don't know, he just felt that he had this obligation to preserve the Masorah, even if it meant that he was going to, lose everything.